In the heart of the deep forest, where the wind sings in the pine trees, there was a guy named Michael. He was a bushcrafter, a person who knows how to survive in the wild, using only his own hands and a minimum of tools. Today, he set himself a challenge: to build a dugout in just one day. Michael chose a spot near a hillside where the soil was soft but strong enough to support the weight of the roof. Armed with his small but sturdy shovel, he began to dig. The earth flew to the sides, and his arms quickly got tired, but he worked without interruption. Shovel by shovel, the pit began to take on the desired shape. Suddenly, as he made another movement with his shovel, he noticed something small and moving in the ground. Looking closely, he saw a tiny mouse. The little guy was shivering from cold and fright. Michael gently took it in his palm, warmed it with his breath, and carried it a little further, under the roots of an old spruce tree, where it could find a new hiding place. "I'm sorry, friend," he smiled. The mouse sat there a little longer, sniffed the air, and quickly disappeared into the moss. Michael went back to work. The foundation for the future dugout is almost ready, but this is just the beginning. Opening his briefcase, he took out a compact folding saw, lightweight but sharp enough to cut through the wood quickly. He carefully examined the trees, choosing those that were straight and not too thick. After selecting a few suitable birches, he put the file to the first one and started working. The small teeth cut into the wood, leaving an even cut, and after a few minutes, the tree fell to the ground with a creak. Michael did not immediately saw the trunks into segments, but left them long so that he could cut them to size on the spot. He worked quickly, cutting down one tree after another until he had enough material for the walls. When he had all the logs he needed, he began to carry them to the construction site. This was the most tiring part of the job, as the long logs were heavier and more difficult to transport. But step by step he carried them, stacking them in a large pile near the future dugout. Michael chose the 4 strongest trunks from the birch logs he had brought and set them aside. First, he took a saw and cut each one to the desired length, leaving straight cuts. Then he took an axe and began to sharpen the lower ends. He held the first log firmly with one hand and used the other to strike hard with the blade, knocking the wood down at an angle. Gradually, the edge took on the shape of a pointed stake. He repeated the same process with the other 3, working rhythmically and methodically. When all 4 poles were ready, he inspected them, making sure the pointed ends were straight and sharp enough to be easily driven into the ground. He took the first log and set it down. At first, he struck a few light blows, then began to hit harder, gradually deepening the log. He took the second log and repeated the process. The third and fourth logs were hammered in the same way. When all 4 pillars were level and deep in the ground, Michael inspected them, making sure they were strong and properly positioned. Now he could move on to building the walls. When the support logs were in place, Michael took one of the logs and tried it on to fit between the posts. It was a little too long, so he laid it on the stump and cut off the excess with a saw. Then he started laying the walls. He took one log at a time, brought it to the structure, and laid it tightly between the supports, pressing them together. Each row became stronger and stronger, and when the entire wall was filled, he filled the gaps between the logs and the ground with soil, carefully tamping it down so that there were no gaps. The work was exhausting, but with each new log he laid, the dugout looked more and more like a real safe haven. After Michael finished the first wall, he immediately started on the second. The first log went down easily and naturally, followed by the second, and he carefully placed it on top of the first, pressing it down so that it lay tightly. He continued to lay the logs one by one, gradually raising the wall. Sometimes he had to adjust the arrangement a bit to make them lie more evenly. When the second wall reached the desired height, he looked at the result with satisfaction and moved on to the third. The third wall was the most important because it had to leave room for an entrance. First, he laid out the logs to a certain height, leaving a wide gap for the future door. After that, he continued to lay the rest, aligning them and pressing them tightly together. The construction of the fourth wall required more attention, as it was connected to two already completed walls. Michael worked carefully, selecting the logs so that they fit snugly against the adjacent walls. He tried each one on again, cut off the excess, and laid it layer by layer. When all four walls were ready, the dugout took on a clear shape. The logs fit snugly, creating a solid and reliable structure ready for the next stages of construction. After finishing the walls, Michael took a saw and went into the woods to find 4 sturdy sticks to support the roof. He carefully examined the young trees, choosing those with sufficient flexibility and strength. When all 4 pillars were ready, he returned to the dugout to continue building the roof. Michael decided to give them even more flexibility so that they would better hold the shape of the future semicircular roof. At first, the wood was a little springy, but gradually gave way, taking on the desired shape. Before installing the roof, he noticed that the tops of the vertical logs were protruding too high and could interfere with the roof's installation. He took a saw and began to gradually cut them off. Now it was possible to tie the flexible arches that would become the basis for the roof. Taking a rope out of his briefcase, he made several tight turns around the logs, then tied secure knots, making sure the structure did not sway. He attached the next 3 curved poles in the same way, placing them at an equal distance from each other. He tied each one carefully, pulling on the rope and making sure the knots were tight. With the flexible supports securely in place, Michael began laying the roof. Starting at one end, he laid the first pad across the curved support so that it fit snugly. Then he took the next one and placed it next to it, pressing it against the previous one. In this way, he gradually filled the entire roof, laying the logs layer by layer. To ensure reliability, he made sure that each log fit snugly against the next, leaving no large gaps. He chose the logs so that they distributed the weight evenly and rested well on the curved supports. When the last log was in place, Michael inspected the roof. It was strong and held its shape well. Now it was time to cover it with moss for thermal insulation. In the forest, he quickly found a place where soft, green moss grew thickly. When he found a suitable area, he knelt down and began to carefully tear off the moss with his hands, trying to remove it in large layers, along with a thin layer of soil. He stacked it in piles so that he could conveniently carry it to the dugout. When Michael had collected enough moss, he returned to the dugout and began laying it on the roof. Starting at the bottom edge of the roof, he carefully laid the moss on top of the logs, spreading it out with his hands to make sure it covered the wood evenly. He pressed it down to make it adhere better to the surface, and then took the next piece and laid it a little higher, creating a dense layer without gaps. Gradually moving upward, he carefully covered the entire roof, making sure that the moss lay evenly and did not slip. When the last piece was laid, Michael crushed the coating a little to make it better fixed. The roof was now completely green, the moss was securely in place, and now all that was left to do was complete the last step. Cover the fur with twigs for additional protection and camouflage. After completing the roof, Michael decided to make a door that would securely close the entrance to the dugout. He envisioned it to be semicircular in shape to match the curved line of the entrance. First, he took a flexible and strong rod that could be bent into an arc. He gently bent it, applying even pressure until he got the shape he wanted. Then he took several straight birch sticks and cut them to the desired length. Using a rope, he began to attach these sticks horizontally to the bent rod, placing them tightly together. For reliability, he made strong knots at each attachment so that the structure would not loosen. When all the sticks were secured, he tested the door. It was light but strong, and it fit well. All that was left was to put it in place and make a simple lock. It was time for the floor, which was also made of moss. He took large clumps and threw them in the middle. Over and over again, he brought up new armfuls and threw them in until the entire floor was covered with a thick layer of soft moss. The night was going to be cold, and heating was essential in the dugout. Michael realized that he needed to make a chimney as soon as possible to install a stove and keep warm. He took a sharpened birch stake and began to punch a hole in the wall of the dugout towards the back so that the smoke could escape. Driving the stake into the soil between the logs, he gradually widened the hole by turning it from side to side. When Michael was harvesting logs for the dugout, he accidentally came across an old ceramic hexagonal tube, a remnant of a former reclamation system. And now, when the time came to equip the chimney, this find came in handy. Thanks to the tube, he could make a reliable channel for the smoke to escape without wasting time on complicated structures. Michael smiled with satisfaction. Sometimes useful things come along by themselves. When the chimney was ready, Michael set about installing the stove, a homemade stove made from a metal ammo box. He laid out the legs, secured them with wiring, and carefully placed the stove on the ground to make sure it was stable. He connected the parts of the chimney and attached the outlet to the ceramic tube, filling the joint tightly with soil for better sealing. After making sure that the construction was secure, Michael opened the lid of the stove and put a few dry twigs inside. Now all he had to do was light a fire. The stove worked flawlessly. A few minutes after it was lit, the heat from it began to evenly fill the dugout, warming the walls and the moss-covered floor. The fire crackled inside and the smoke smoothly exited through the installed chimney, not lingering in the room. Feeling the pleasant warmth, Michael decided it was time to make himself some dinner. He took a frying pan out of his briefcase, put it on top of the stove, and put juicy sausages on it. They quickly began to fry, filling the dugout with a delicious aroma. While they were roasting, he chopped vegetables, tomatoes and sweet peppers, that would add freshness and flavor to his simple but well-deserved dinner. The sausages were gradually covered with a ruddy crust, and with each turn they became even more appetizing. The fat from the frying pan was sizzling, releasing a flavor that filled the entire dugout. Michael was careful not to let them burn, and from time to time he would lightly press them down with a spatula to make the crust even crispier. When the sausages turned a perfect golden color, he began to eat them right out of the pan in a bite with juicy vegetables. After a hard day's work, it was an incredible reward. His appetite could be compared to a hungry wolf. Michael finished the last piece of hot sausage, wiped his hands, and cleaned up after himself. It was a simple dinner, but after a busy day, it seemed like a real celebration. He dragged his briefcase into the dugout so that everything he needed was at hand and took out a blanket. Spreading it out on a thick layer of moss near the stove, Michael lay down, feeling the warmth of the stove envelop his body. He relaxed, staring into the darkness, listening to the crackling of the coals. When he opened the door of the dugout, he saw a real winter miracle. All traces of yesterday's work had disappeared under a thick layer of fluffy snow. The trees were covered with a white blanket, and the sun's rays penetrated the branches, making the snowflakes sparkle like small jewels. Michael stepped outside, breathed in the crystal clear air, and stepped onto the soft snow, which made a pleasant noise under his feet. He slowly walked deep into the forest, admiring this winter fairy tale. As he walked through the snowy forest, he remembered the fragrant pine needle tea, which is not only delicious but also rich in vitamins. Finding a young pine tree, he carefully picked a few fresh branches, choosing those that were bright green and fragrant. Their needles smelled of freshness, resin, and a frosty morning. With the bundle of needles in hand, Michael returned to the dugout, ready to make a hot, fragrant tea to start this beautiful day. Michael took his small shovel and dug a shallow hole for the fire nearby to keep the wind from blowing the heat away. Gathering dry twigs and bark, he quickly lit the fire and began to gradually add slightly thicker logs to keep the fire burning steadily. For the tea, Michael took a few fresh pine twigs and gently crushed them in his hands to release their essential oils. Then, he opened the lid of the kettle and carefully placed the needles inside. Taking a bottle of water, he slowly poured it over the twigs, watching as they floated to the surface. The water immediately took on a light, resinous aroma. Now that everything was ready, Michael hung the kettle on the horizontal stake above the fire. The flames gradually heated the metal, the water began to hum, and a pleasant pine scent drifted from the kettle. Soon the first bubbles appeared, and the tea started to boil, developing a rich flavor and color. When the tea had steeped well, Michael removed the kettle from the support and carefully opened the lid. Hot, fragrant steam rose up, enveloping his face with a pleasant pine aroma. He took his metal cup, tilted the kettle, and slowly poured the hot drink into it. The greenish golden liquid filled the cup, and the light resinous scent became even more pronounced. He wrapped his hands around the cup and took his first sip. Taking a candy from his pocket, he slowly unwrapped it and placed it in his mouth. The sweetness of the candy paired perfectly with the slightly tangy flavor of the pine tea, creating a pleasant contrast. Breathing in the crisp forest air, Michael slowly savored his tea, enjoying the moment of silence and harmony with nature. After Michael finished his tea, he grabbed a bottle of water and poured it over the fire. The coals hissed, steam rose, and the flames finally died down. Making sure everything was safe, Michael picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and glanced back at the earth hut. It stood firm and cozy, ready to wait for him whenever he decided to return. Smiling, he turned and walked forward, leaving his footprints in the soft snow. New adventures awaited him ahead.